November 1884, Fifth Avenue, New York City. A construction crew breaks ground at the corner of 59th Street. They are not building a mansion. They are building something that will destroy mansions. Within months, a 9-story building will rise on this corner. It will have no ballrooms, no grand staircases, no private gardens, just apartments. Wealthy families will live stacked on top of each other like factory workers in tenements. The idea seems insane. But within 20 years, this building and others like it will make Fifth Avenue mansions worthless. This is the story of how apartments killed the Gilded Age. The building going up at Fifth Avenue and 59th Street was called the Dakota. The name was a joke. The location was so far north, so far from fashionable society, that people said it might as well be in the Dakota Territory. The wilderness, the frontier. No respectable family lived that far uptown. The established wealthy clustered around Washington Square and Lower Fifth Avenue. The new rich were building mansions in the 50s. But 59th Street? That was beyond civilization. Edward S. Clark did not care what people said. Clark had inherited a fortune from the Singer Sewing Machine Company. His partner, Isaac Singer, had died in 1875, leaving Clark to manage an empire that generated millions annually. Clark had money. More importantly, he had vision. He looked at Manhattan and saw what others missed. The city was growing north. Land was cheaper uptown. And the wealthy, whether they knew it yet or not, were about to face a crisis that would make their mansions unbearable. Clark hired Henry Hardenberg as his architect. Hardenberg was young but talented. He understood that if wealthy people were going to live in apartments, the building could not look like an apartment building. It had to look like a palace. So he designed the Dakota in the German Renaissance style. Brick and terracotta, gables and dormers, a central courtyard. The building would be enormous. 9 stories, 65 apartments. It would be the largest residential building in New York City. The construction took 3 years. The costs exceeded $2 million. That was an astronomical sum in 1884. A Fifth Avenue mansion might cost $300,000. Clark was spending 7 times that on a building where families would not even own their homes outright. They would rent, or later buy shares in a cooperative corporation that owned the building. The whole concept was radical. In 1884, apartments in New York meant tenements, crowded buildings where immigrant families lived in 3 or 4 room units, buildings without indoor plumbing, without heat, without light. Apartments meant poverty. The working poor lived in apartments. The middle class aspired to row houses. The wealthy built mansions. That was the hierarchy. That was how things worked. Clark was proposing to reverse that hierarchy. He was suggesting that wealthy families might actually prefer apartments. The skepticism was universal. Newspapers mocked the project. Society matrons declared they would never set foot in such a building. The idea that a Vanderbilt or an Astor would live in an apartment, sharing walls with other families, was absurd. Offensive even. It violated every principle of how the elite demonstrated their status. But Clark had calculated something others had not. He understood that the mansion system was starting to crack. The economics were becoming impossible. A typical Fifth Avenue mansion required a staff of 20 to 30 servants: butler, housekeeper, cook, kitchen maids, parlor maids, chambermaids, laundry maids, footmen, coachmen, stable hands, gardeners. The wages alone exceeded $20,000 annually. Then came heating costs, property taxes, maintenance, repairs. A mansion consumed $50,000 to $70,000 every year just to operate, and it generated no income. It was pure expense. An apartment building like the Dakota could spread those costs across dozens of families. The building would employ a large staff, yes, but the residents would share the expense. Each apartment would have access to a doorman, to porters, to maintenance workers, to a central heating system, to elevators operated by attendants. The services would equal or exceed what a private mansion offered, but the cost per family would be a fraction. Clark also understood another problem with mansions. They were permanent. Once you built a mansion, you were stuck with it. If your fortune changed, if your family shrank, if you wanted to move, you faced enormous complications. Selling a mansion took months or years. The market was limited, and you lost money on the transaction almost even always. An apartment offered flexibility. You could move in quickly. You could leave when circumstances changed. You were not trapped by your real estate. The Dakota opened in October 1884. The first residents moved in cautiously. They were not the most elite families. The Astors and Vanderbilts stayed in their mansions. But successful professionals, wealthy merchants, and comfortable upper-middle-class families took apartments. They discovered something surprising. Living in the Dakota was pleasant. The apartments were huge. Some had 15 or 20 rooms. The ceilings were high. The finishes were luxurious. Dark wood paneling, marble fireplaces, parquet floors. You could not tell from inside that you were in an apartment rather than a house. The services were extraordinary. The building had hydraulic elevators, running hot water, central heating that actually worked, gas lighting in every room, a telegraph office in the lobby, package receiving. The staff handled deliveries and maintained common areas. Residents never worried about hiring repairmen or managing tradesmen. The building took care of everything. For families used to managing large staffs and constant household crises, the relief was immediate. The courtyard was a revelation. In a private mansion, you had a small yard or garden, enclosed by walls, private but limited. The Dakota's courtyard was enormous. Shared space, yes, but so large and so beautifully maintained that it felt like a private park. Children could play safely. Adults could stroll. The design created community without forcing interaction. You could be social or private as you chose. The location, which everyone had mocked, turned out to be an advantage. The Dakota faced Central Park. Every west-facing apartment had park views. In a city where buildings were getting taller and denser, where views were disappearing, the Dakota offered permanent vistas. No one could build in Central Park. That view was guaranteed forever. Fifth Avenue mansions further south faced other mansions. They had no views at all. Within 2 years, the Dakota was fully occupied. The waiting list grew. Society's initial horror was fading into curiosity. The families living there seemed happy. They were not embarrassed. They entertained in their apartments. They hosted dinners and receptions. Guests arrived and found the experience surprisingly pleasant. The building was quiet. The apartments were private. The services were impeccable. And the location was becoming fashionable as more people discovered the beauty of living near Central Park. Other developers watched carefully. If Clark could fill a building with wealthy renters this far uptown, perhaps the model had potential. Perhaps apartments were not just for the poor after all. Perhaps the wealthy might actually prefer them, given the right design and the right location and the right approach. The question was whether the Dakota was a unique success or the beginning of something larger. The answer would come in the 1890s. But first, the economic pressures on mansion owners needed to intensify. The problems that made apartments attractive needed to become impossible to ignore, and that was already happening. Across Fifth Avenue, in dozens of private mansions, families were discovering that their palaces were becoming prisons. The costs were rising. The servants were becoming scarce. The taxes were climbing, and there was no solution in sight. The system that had created the Gilded Age mansion was starting to collapse. The Dakota and the buildings it inspired would offer an escape route, but only for those willing to abandon the old rules and embrace something new. The problem with Fifth Avenue mansions became obvious to anyone who examined the numbers. In 1890, William Henry Vanderbilt owned a double mansion at Fifth Avenue and 51st Street. The property occupied an entire block front. The house contained more than 100 rooms. The annual operating costs exceeded $100,000. Vanderbilt could afford it. His fortune was estimated at $200 million. But even he recognized the mathematics were unsustainable. When he died in 1885, his heirs discovered the mansion was not an asset. It was a liability. The expenses broke down into categories, all of them growing. Property taxes were rising as New York assessed these palaces at their true value. A mansion worth $1 million generated $20,000 annually in taxes. Heating costs in winter were staggering. These houses had dozens of fireplaces, plus early central heating systems that burned coal by the ton. One mansion could consume $500 monthly just staying warm. In summer, there was no cooling, but the houses still needed maintenance, cleaning, and full staffing. The staff requirements were the real problem. A mansion with 40 rooms needed at least 20 servants to function properly, more if the family entertained regularly. The wages varied by position, but averaged $500 to $800 annually per servant. A full staff cost $12,000 to $15,000 yearly in wages alone. Then came the servants' quarters, which needed furnishing and maintaining. The servants ate food the family provided. They wore uniforms the family purchased. They required medical care when they fell ill. The true cost of domestic labor was nearly double the actual wages. Managing a household staff was itself a full-time job that fell primarily to the lady of the house. She was responsible for hiring, training, supervising, and if necessary, dismissing every servant. She planned menus with the cook. She inspected rooms to ensure maids cleaned properly. She managed conflicts between staff members. She handled the constant turnover as servants left for better positions or got married or simply disappeared. The work was exhausting and never-ending. The quality of domestic servants was declining noticeably by the 1890s. The best workers had options now. Factories paid better than household service. Department stores hired women for sales positions that offered more freedom and dignity than being a maid. Young men who might once have been footmen or stable hands could find work in offices or skilled trades. The people willing to work as live-in servants were increasingly those who had no better alternatives. Training them took time. Keeping them required constant attention. Some mansion owners tried to solve the problem by paying higher wages. This created a competitive market that drove costs up for everyone. A good butler in 1880 earned $600 annually. By 1895, he could demand $1,000 or more. Skilled cooks could name their price. The families who paid top wages got better servants, but at costs that even wealthy households found burdensome. And paying more did not solve the fundamental problem. Good servants were simply becoming scarce. The mansions themselves were maintenance nightmares. These buildings were constructed in an era before modern materials and systems. They leaked. They settled. They required constant repair. Roofs needed replacing every 15 years. Paint deteriorated. Wood rotted. Plaster cracked. Stone facades weathered and needed repointing. Each problem required hiring contractors, supervising work, and paying bills that arrived with disturbing frequency. A mansion was never finished. It was always demanding attention and money. The design of these houses created inefficiencies that became obvious over time. The kitchens were in basements, far from dining rooms. Food arrived cold. The multiple floors required servants to climb stairs constantly, wasting time and energy. The enormous public rooms on the first floor were used perhaps once a week for entertaining, but they needed daily cleaning and heating. The private family quarters were often cramped relative to the grand public spaces. The houses were designed for display, not for comfortable daily living. Security was another growing concern. Mansions stood alone, separated from neighbors, vulnerable to break-ins. The wealthy were becoming targets for thieves who knew these houses contained valuable art, jewelry, and silver. Some families hired private guards. Others installed elaborate alarm systems. Both solutions added to the operating costs and reminded residents that their isolation made them vulnerable. The more wealth these houses displayed, the more security they required. The social system that justified mansions was also starting to crack. Mrs. William Astor had famously declared that New York society consisted of exactly 400 people. Her ballroom held 400. Therefore, society was 400. This artificial limit created intense competition for inclusion. Being invited to the right dinners and balls was essential. Hosting lavish entertainments was required. The mansion was the stage where this performance occurred. Without the mansion, you could not compete for social position. But by the 1890s, the system was breaking down. Too many new millionaires were arriving. The railroad fortunes, the steel fortunes, the oil fortunes. Men who were richer than the old guard but lacked the social credentials. They built mansions to force acceptance. They threw parties that cost more than the established families could afford. They bought art and jewels and yachts to prove their status. The competition escalated beyond sustainability. What had been an exclusive club was becoming an auction where the highest bidder won. Some families recognized the absurdity and quietly withdrew. They maintained their social obligations but stopped trying to outspend their neighbors. They looked for alternatives that preserved their status without requiring constant financial warfare. And when they looked, they increasingly noticed buildings like the Dakota. Apartment buildings where wealthy families lived comfortably, entertained gracefully, and spent far less money than mansion owners. The economic crisis hit hardest during the Panic of 1893. The stock market crashed, banks failed, railroads went bankrupt. Fortunes that had seemed secure disappeared. Families who had lived on investment income discovered their assets had evaporated. The mansions that had symbolized their wealth suddenly became impossible to maintain. Staff had to be dismissed. Rooms had to be closed off. Houses that had glittered with light and activity went dark and silent. Some families lost everything and had to sell their mansions. The market was terrible. Buyers were scarce. The property sat empty for months or years. When they finally sold, the prices were a fraction of construction costs. A mansion that cost $500,000 to build in 1880 might sell for $150,000 in 1895. The loss was staggering, and the buyer faced all the same problems. The seller had fled. Other families held on, but scaled back dramatically. They kept a skeleton staff. They stopped entertaining. They lived in a few rooms and left the rest unused. These partial solutions preserved ownership, but destroyed the purpose. A mansion that was not fully staffed and constantly used was just a very expensive house. The social performance that justified the costs could not happen. The families were trapped in buildings they could neither afford nor escape. The apartment buildings offered a specific solution. The costs were predictable and controllable. You paid a monthly rent or maintenance fee. That fee covered everything: taxes, insurance, heat, water, elevator operation, doorman service, building maintenance. There were no surprises, no emergency repairs, no problems with servants who quit or demanded raises. The building management handled everything. You simply paid your fee and lived your life. The services in luxury apartment buildings were becoming extraordinary. The Dakota had established the model. Other buildings competed by offering more. Some had private dining rooms residents could reserve for parties. Some had roof gardens. Some had gymnasiums and billiard rooms. Every building had doormen who received packages, announced visitors, and maintained security. Many had porters who cleaned apartments and ran errands. The level of service equaled what a private household provided, but without any management burden on the resident. The cooperative ownership model solved the exclusivity problem. In a rental building, the landlord decided who could lease apartments. Wealthy families worried about living near anyone the landlord accepted. But in a cooperative, The existing residents controlled admissions. When an apartment went up for sale, the board interviewed potential buyers. They could reject anyone for any reason. This let buildings maintain social standards as strict as any exclusive club. The address guaranteed you lived among people of your own class. Some buildings became famous for their selectivity. Getting accepted was harder than being invited to Ms. Astor's balls. The board examined your finances, your social connections, your reputation. They wanted proof you could afford the maintenance fees. They wanted references from other residents. They wanted certainty you would fit in. Rejection was common and humiliating, but acceptance meant you had arrived. The building's reputation elevated your own. The developers who built these buildings became wealthy themselves. The mathematics worked beautifully from the developer perspective. You bought land, you constructed a building, you sold apartments to initial buyers, or rented them for income. The building's value exceeded construction costs because you were selling location, prestige, and services, not just square footage. A well-located luxury apartment building returned the initial investment within 5 to 7 years. After that, it generated pure profit. James T. Lee understood this better than most developers. Lee came from nothing. He worked his way up in real estate, learning every detail of construction, financing, and marketing. By 1900, he was building apartment buildings throughout Manhattan. His formula was consistent. Choose locations near Central Park or fashionable neighborhoods. Design buildings with generous apartments and luxury finishes. Market them to wealthy families who were tired of mansion maintenance. Price them high enough that exclusivity was guaranteed. Lee made millions. He became one of New York's most successful developers. His buildings were known for quality and strict social standards. Getting into a Lee building meant something. It was a stamp of approval. Lee was selective about who he allowed to purchase. He wanted residents who would maintain property values and social prestige. His self-interest aligned perfectly with buyer desires. Everyone wanted to live among the right people. Lee made sure they could. The apartment building boom of the 1890s and early 1900s transformed Manhattan real estate. Buildings rose on Fifth Avenue, on Park Avenue, on Central Park West. Each tried to outdo its competitors. Larger apartments, better services, more impressive lobbies. The arms race that had driven mansion construction shifted to apartment buildings. But the economics were completely different. Apartment buildings made money. Mansions consumed it. Developers got rich. Mansion owners went broke. By 1900, the social barrier against apartment living was collapsing rapidly. Families who 5 years earlier would have been horrified at the suggestion were quietly touring apartment buildings. They told themselves they were just looking, just curious. But the appeal was undeniable. The apartments were beautiful, the services were excellent, and the freedom from household management was intoxicating. Women especially recognized what apartments offered. No more managing a staff of 20. No more endless meetings with cooks and housekeepers. No more inspecting rooms and arbitrating servant disputes. The building handled everything. The early apartment buildings clustered around Central Park because the location offered permanent advantages. Park views could not be blocked. The green space provided beauty and fresh air in a city becoming increasingly congested. Proximity to the park was becoming more valuable as Manhattan filled in with taller buildings. Families who bought apartments facing Central Park were making a smart investment. Those views would appreciate in value forever. Fifth Avenue south of 59th Street was still dominated by mansions in 1900. The Vanderbilt houses, the Astor properties, dozens of elaborate palaces built in the 1880s and 1890s. These buildings represented billions in today's money. But cracks were appearing. Some houses stood empty. Others had been sold and resold as families discovered they could not afford the upkeep. A few had been converted to clubs or commercial uses. The future was becoming obvious, even if no one wanted to admit it yet. Park Avenue was a different story entirely. In 1900, Park Avenue was not fashionable at all. The avenue ran over open railroad tracks. Trains went up and down the center of the street in an open cut. The noise was constant. Coal smoke from locomotives covered everything in soot. The smell was terrible. Only the very poor lived on Park Avenue. Tenements lined the street. The avenue was industrial, dirty, working class. No wealthy family would consider living there, but railroad companies were under pressure to cover the tracks. The open cut was dangerous. Children fell in. Adults were struck by trains. The noise complaints were endless. In 1903, the New York Central Railroad began a massive project to cover the tracks completely. The work took years, but when finished, Park Avenue would be transformed. The tracks would be underground. The surface would be a wide boulevard with planted medians. The noise and smoke would be gone. The avenue would suddenly become prime real estate. Developers saw the opportunity immediately. As soon as the railroad announced the track covering project, they began buying property on Park Avenue. The prices were low because the avenue was still a slum. But the smart developers understood that within 10 years, Park Avenue would rival Fifth Avenue for prestige. They bought cheaply and waited. When the transformation completed, they would build luxury apartment buildings on land that cost a fraction of Fifth Avenue prices. The apartment buildings going up in the early 1900s were increasingly sophisticated. Architects learned what wealthy residents wanted. The apartments needed to be large. 12 to 20 rooms was typical for luxury units. The layouts needed to separate public and private spaces clearly. Entertaining areas near the entrance, family bedrooms at the rear, service areas hidden completely. The best apartments felt like private houses that happened to be stacked vertically. Rosario Candela emerged as the master of apartment design. Candela was born in Sicily in 1890. His family immigrated to New York when he was a boy. He studied architecture and by his 20s was working for developers who specialized in luxury buildings. Candela understood proportion and flow better than anyone. His floor plans made apartments feel spacious even when square footage was limited. His rooms had beautiful proportions. His layouts created privacy within shared buildings. Candela's breakthrough was recognizing that wealthy residents needed certain specific things. They needed space to entertain formally. They needed private family areas. They needed good servant quarters and service circulation. And critically, they needed to feel like they owned a complete home, not just part of a building. Candela designed apartments where you entered through a private foyer. You could not see into other apartments. You could not hear your neighbors. The apartment felt self-contained. The Dakota had pioneered many of these ideas, but Candela refined them to perfection. His apartments had long galleries that mimicked mansion hallways. They had proper dining rooms that could seat 12. They had libraries and sitting rooms and sunrooms. The public rooms faced the street for light and views. The bedrooms faced courtyards for quiet and privacy. Every detail served a purpose. Nothing was wasted. Candela also understood the importance of staff circulation. Wealthy families still employed servants in apartments, just fewer of them. A mansion might have 20 staff. An apartment might have 5. But those 5 needed proper workspaces. Candela designed service entrances separate from the main entrance. He included service elevators that servants used exclusively. The kitchens connected to service halls so staff could move through the apartment without being seen. The bedrooms had small adjoining rooms for personal maids. The layouts preserved the social boundaries between family and servants that wealthy residents considered essential. By 1910, Candela was the most sought-after apartment architect in New York. Developers competed to hire him. Buildings he designed commanded premium prices. Residents knew a Candela apartment would be perfectly laid out. The floor plans would make sense. The proportions would be beautiful. Living there would feel right in ways that were hard to articulate, but impossible to miss. Candela was creating the template for luxury apartment living that would define the form for the next century. The cooperative ownership model was evolving rapidly. Early co-ops had been somewhat informal. By 1910, the legal structures were sophisticated. A corporation owned the building. Residents bought shares in that corporation. The number of shares you owned corresponded to your apartment size and value. Owning shares gave you a proprietary lease that allowed you to occupy your specific unit. You could sell your shares, but only to buyers the board approved. The system combined ownership benefits with the ability to control your neighbors. The board structure became increasingly powerful. Typically, 5 to 9 residents served on the cooperative board. They hired building management. They set policies for the building. They approved or rejected potential buyers. They could charge special assessments if building reserves ran low. They controlled everything about building operations. Serving on the board was prestigious and gave you significant power over property values and resident quality. Some buildings became famous for their rejection rates. Stories circulated about famous people rejected by co-op boards. Rich didn't guarantee acceptance. The boards wanted the right kind of rich. Old money was better than new. Business fortunes were better than entertainment fortunes. Certain professions were suspect. Certain ethnicities were excluded completely. The discrimination was blatant and legal. The boards answered to no one but themselves. This selectivity increased property values paradoxically. If anyone with money could buy in, the building lost cachet. But if the board maintained strict standards, getting accepted meant something. It elevated your social standing. People would pay premiums to live in buildings known for exclusivity. The economics rewarded discrimination. Buildings that accepted anyone were worth less than buildings that rejected most applicants. The First World War accelerated every trend favoring apartments over mansions. When America entered the war in 1917, young men enlisted or were drafted. The servant class that had sustained mansion operations essentially disappeared. Women who would have been maids took factory jobs supporting war production. The work paid better and offered more freedom. When the war ended in 1918, most of these workers did not return to domestic service. They had discovered alternatives. The servant crisis became acute. Families who once employed 20 staff could barely find 5. The available workers demanded higher wages and better conditions. The cost of household help tripled between 1915 and 1920. Mansions that had been barely affordable became impossible. Owners who had resisted apartments suddenly had no choice. They could not operate their houses without staff. They had to move. The apartment buildings were not immune to the servant shortage, but they handled it better. A building employed a large central staff: doormen, porters, maintenance workers, cleaning crews. These were professional positions with regular hours and decent wages. The jobs attracted workers who would not consider private household service. The buildings could maintain service levels even when private households failed completely. Individual apartments still employed some private servants, a cook, perhaps a personal maid. But the building provided so many services that private staff needs were minimal. The building cleaned common areas. The building maintained mechanical systems. The building handled deliveries and package receiving. The building provided security. Apartment residents needed far fewer personal servants than mansion owners. This made apartment living possible even during severe labor shortages. Technology was transforming apartment buildings in ways that made them superior to mansions. By 1920, most luxury apartments had electric lights throughout. Electric elevators that were faster and more reliable than hydraulic versions. Telephone service in every unit. Central heating that could be controlled from individual apartments. Some buildings had central vacuum systems. The newest buildings were experimenting with electric refrigeration. These technologies were expensive to install in single-family houses, but spread across a large apartment building, the cost per unit was reasonable. Mansions struggled to adapt to new technology. Retrofitting electric wiring into a house built for gas lights was complicated and expensive. Installing central heating in a building designed for fireplaces required major reconstruction. Elevators in private houses were rare and required dedicated maintenance. The mansions that had been built in the 1880s and 1890s were becoming obsolete. They lacked the infrastructure modern living required. Updating them cost more than they were worth. The economics were now impossible to ignore. A luxury apartment on Fifth Avenue cost perhaps $50,000 to purchase your co-op shares. Monthly maintenance fees were $500 to $800. That covered everything: taxes, heat, water, staff, repairs. Your total housing cost was under $10,000 annually. A comparable mansion cost $300,000 to purchase. Annual operating costs were $70,000 to $100,000. You needed liquid assets of $2 million just to sustain the house. The difference was absurd. Wealthy families were doing the math. Young heirs inheriting fortunes made different choices than their parents. They bought apartments. They invested their capital in businesses and securities rather than tying it up in real estate. They traveled more because apartments required no maintenance during absences. They lived well on a fraction of what mansion life had cost. The lifestyle was actually superior if you valued freedom over display. The social acceptance was now complete. By 1920, no stigma attached to apartment living. The best families lived in apartments. The most prestigious addresses were apartment buildings. The Dakota, which had been mocked as Clark's Folly in 1884, was now one of New York's most exclusive addresses. Buildings on Fifth Avenue and Park Avenue were becoming legendary. Living in the right building marked you as successfully wealthy in ways a mansion no longer could. Mrs. Astor had died in 1908. Her ballroom, which had defined society as exactly 400 people, stood empty in her mansion. Her son sold the house in 1925. It was demolished shortly after. The destruction of the Astor Mansion was symbolic. The woman who had insisted on private palaces and formal entertaining was gone. The system she defended was gone. The future belonged to apartment buildings that offered everything mansions had promised but delivered it efficiently and affordably. The 1920s saw an explosion of luxury apartment construction. More buildings rose in that decade than in all previous decades combined. Fifth Avenue between 59th and 96th Streets became a canyon of apartment towers. Park Avenue transformed from railroad slum to the most exclusive residential corridor in America. The construction was speculative, driven by developers who understood the economics perfectly. Every building sold out quickly. Every building generated enormous profits. The appetite for luxury apartments seemed unlimited. The architects who designed these buildings formed an elite group. Rosario Candela was the acknowledged master, but others competed fiercely. R. Carpenter designed elegant buildings with impeccable proportions. Emery Roth brought European sophistication to Park Avenue towers. These architects understood they were creating a new building type, not just apartment buildings, not just residential towers. They were designing vertical mansions that happened to stack multiple families in one structure. The buildings competed on multiple dimensions. Location obviously mattered. Fifth Avenue addresses commanded premiums over side streets. Park Avenue was becoming equally prestigious as the transformation from railroad tracks to planted boulevard completed. Buildings on corners were more desirable than mid-block properties. The southeast corner of any intersection got the most light and the best views. Developers fought for those sites. Size mattered within limits. Apartments needed to be large enough to feel substantial. 12 to 15 rooms was the sweet spot for family apartments. Smaller units appealed to wealthy single people or couples without children. But the market wanted spacious layouts that could accommodate entertaining and family life. Buildings that offered the largest apartments attracted the most status-conscious buyers. The finishes and materials became increasingly lavish. Marble lobbies with elaborate details, bronze elevator doors with decorative metalwork, hardwood floors in every room, plaster moldings on ceilings, fireplaces in living rooms and libraries. bathrooms with the latest fixtures, kitchens with professional-grade equipment. The buildings were competing with mansions, so the quality had to match or exceed what mansion owners had known. The services became the critical differentiator. Every building had doormen, but how many? Were they there 24 hours? Did they remember residents by name and provide personalized service? Did they handle packages discreetly? Did they maintain security without being intrusive? The best buildings had doormen who functioned like the butler in a private house. They knew who you were. They anticipated your needs. They made you feel cared for. Elevator operators were another mark of quality. In lesser buildings, residents operated elevators themselves by pressing buttons. In luxury buildings, attendants ran the elevators. They wore uniforms. They addressed residents respectfully. They made small talk without being familiar. The elevator ride became an experience rather than just transportation. The operators were selected for appearance and demeanor, as much as technical skill. Building services expanded beyond basics. Many buildings offered private dining rooms. Residents could reserve for dinner parties. Some had ballrooms for larger entertainments. Libraries with collections residents could borrow from. Children's playrooms supervised by staff. Storage rooms in basements where residents could keep trunks and seasonal items. The buildings were creating the infrastructure that private houses had provided, but doing it more efficiently through shared resources. Mechanical systems were advancing rapidly. By the mid-1920s, the newest buildings had sophisticated heating and cooling, not air conditioning in the modern sense, but systems that could cool air somewhat during summer months. The results were imperfect but represented enormous improvement over having no cooling at all. In winter, the heating systems maintained comfortable temperatures throughout the buildings. Residents controlled their own thermostats. The days of freezing and drafty mansions were over. The Depression hit in October 1929, the stock market crashed, banks failed, fortunes evaporated. The construction boom should have ended immediately, but something unexpected happened. Luxury apartment construction continued. A few projects already in progress were completed, but new projects also broke ground. The economics still made sense even in a collapsing economy, perhaps especially in a collapsing economy. Apartments offered stability that mansions could not provide. The reasons were multiple and reinforcing. Wealthy families who lost significant portions of their fortunes could no longer afford mansions at all, but they could afford apartments. Downsizing to an apartment preserved social standing while dramatically reducing costs. Selling the mansion provided capital to live on. Buying co-op shares in a good building cost far less. The difference could be invested to generate income. The math worked even for families in financial distress. The buildings themselves were safer investments than almost any alternative. Luxury apartment buildings in prime locations held their value. The Depression hit all real estate, but Park Avenue and Fifth Avenue apartments declined less than anything else. The very wealthy were still wealthy even after the crash. They still needed places to live. They still valued prestige and quality. The best buildings maintained their desirability. One building that opened during the Depression became the single most important address in New York. 740 Park Avenue began construction in 1929. The timing seemed insane. The stock market crashed 2 months after ground was broken. But the developers continued. The architect was Rosario Candela at the peak of his powers. The location was the best block of Park Avenue between 71st and 72nd Streets. The building would have 31 apartments, only 31 units in a building that tall. The apartments would be enormous. The largest had 20 rooms and covered an entire floor. The design was perfection. Candela created layouts that felt like private mansions. Each apartment had a proper entrance gallery, a formal living room, a library, a dining room that seated 12 easily, multiple bedrooms with private baths, servant quarters separate from family spaces, service entrances, and service elevators hidden from view. The apartments had everything a mansion provided, except the burden of ownership. The building's facade was elegant limestone. restrained decoration, classical proportions. It did not scream wealth, it whispered it. The entrance was marked by an understated canopy. The lobby was beautiful but not ostentatious. Marble floors, wood paneling, excellent lighting. The message was clear. This building was for people who did not need to prove anything. Their address did that for them. 740 Park Avenue opened in 1930. The Depression was worsening. Banks were failing. Unemployment was rising. Yet the building sold out. The buyers were a who's who of American wealth and power. Investment bankers, corporate executives, old money families, new money families who had made it through the crash. The building immediately became known as the most exclusive address in New York. More than that, it became a symbol of American power. The board at 740 Park was legendarily strict. Getting approved required demonstrating enormous wealth, but wealth alone was insufficient. You needed the right kind of wealth, the right profession, the right social connections, the right background. Rejection was common even for multimillionaires. The board rejected people routinely for reasons they never explained. The exclusivity made the building more desirable. People wanted what they could not have. The residents of 740 Park Avenue would include some of the most powerful people in America over the following decades. David Rockefeller lived there. John D. Rockefeller Jr. bought an apartment there. Corporate titans, banking executives, people who made decisions that affected millions. Living at 740 Park meant you had arrived at the absolute pinnacle of American society. The building represented the complete victory of apartment living over mansion ownership. Other buildings competed with 740 Park, but none quite matched its prestige. 778 Park Avenue was equally beautiful and almost as exclusive. 834 Fifth Avenue was magnificent. 1040 Fifth Avenue had spectacular park views. Each building had its devotees. Each developed its own character and reputation. But 740 Park remained the gold standard, the address that mattered most. The mansion demolitions accelerated during the 1930s. The Depression made already difficult economics completely impossible. Families who had struggled to maintain houses before 1929 could not continue afterward. The mansions went on the market. No buyers appeared. The asking prices dropped. Still no buyers. Eventually, the properties sold for land value only. The mansions were demolished within months of sale. The Cornelius Vanderbilt second mansion came down in 1927, just before the crash. The timing was coincidental, but symbolic. The largest private residence ever built in New York City was destroyed after standing only 45 years. The site became a department store. Commerce replaced residential use. The message was clear. Private mansions made no economic sense on Manhattan real estate. Other Vanderbilt houses followed. The William K. Vanderbilt Mansion was demolished in 1926. The Havemeyer Mansion came down in 1930. The Whitney Mansion fell in 1942. One by one, the palaces disappeared. The wrecking balls destroyed in months what had taken years to build. The carved limestone facades were smashed to rubble. The elaborate interiors were stripped and sold for salvage. The architectural heritage of the Gilded Age was being systematically erased. Some people mourned the loss. Architectural historians recognized that important buildings were disappearing. Preservationists tried to save a few examples, but the economics were overwhelming. The land was too valuable. The buildings were too expensive to maintain. Even families who wanted to preserve their ancestral homes could not afford to keep them. Sentiment could not compete with taxes and operating costs. A few mansions survived by transforming their use. The Frick Mansion became a museum, as Henry Clay Frick had planned. The Cooper Hewitt Mansion became a museum decades later. A handful became clubs or schools. But these were rare exceptions. Most mansions were demolished and replaced with apartment buildings or commercial structures. The transformation was thorough and irreversible. The apartment buildings that replaced mansions were themselves often beautiful. The architecture of the 1920s and 1930s produced some of New York's finest buildings. Art Deco designs with elegant setbacks, classical buildings with perfect proportions, modernist experiments that pushed boundaries. The new construction was not always inferior to what it replaced. It was just different. And it served a different purpose: efficiency rather than display, income rather than expense. Park Avenue's transformation was complete by 1935. The railroad tracks were long gone. The planted median ran the length of the avenue with flowers and trees. Apartment buildings lined both sides, brick or limestone facades, uniformed doormen under canopy. The avenue that had been a slum was now the most prestigious residential street in America. The change had taken less than 30 years. The speed was remarkable. The residents of these buildings lived well, better in many ways than mansion owners had. They had more free time because they had no household management burdens. They had more flexibility because they could travel without worrying about empty houses. They had more financial security because apartments cost far less than mansions. And they had more genuine privacy because in a well-designed building, your neighbors were invisible and silent. The social life adapted to apartment living. People still entertained, but the entertainments changed. Dinner parties for 8 or 12 rather than balls for 100. Cocktail receptions in apartments rather than formal dances in ballrooms. The scale was smaller, but the quality could be higher. Intimate gatherings with carefully selected guests rather than obligatory events for everyone who mattered socially. The younger generation embraced apartments enthusiastically. People born around 1900 came of age in the 1920s. They had no memory of why mansions mattered. They had no attachment to the old system. They looked at apartments and saw freedom. They could live well without the burdens their parents had carried. They could invest their money productively rather than tying it up in real estate. They could focus on careers and families and interests rather than household management. The apartments offered liberation. By 1940, the transition was essentially complete. Manhattan's wealthy lived in apartments. A few eccentrics held on to private houses. A few old families refused to acknowledge reality. But the overwhelming majority had made the switch. Apartments were not just acceptable, they were preferred. The stigma that had existed in 1880 was gone completely. Apartment living was now the norm for urban elites. The system that had created Fifth Avenue mansions was dead. The apartment buildings had won. The Second World War reinforced every advantage apartments offered over mansions. When America entered the conflict in December 1941, the domestic labor force disappeared almost entirely. Men enlisted or were drafted. Women took factory jobs making planes, ships, and weapons. The few people still willing to work in households could demand astronomical wages. Mansion owners who had barely survived the Depression found the war made their houses completely unmanageable. The government imposed rationing on materials and fuel. Coal for heating became scarce. Gasoline for automobiles was restricted. Food required ration stamps. Everything was limited. Operating a large private house became difficult and socially questionable. Living in a huge mansion while soldiers fought overseas looked unpatriotic. Some mansion owners actually faced criticism for consuming resources that could go to the war effort. Apartments avoided this problem entirely. The shared services meant resources were used efficiently. Many wealthy families contributed to the war effort by donating their mansions for institutional use. The buildings became hospitals, offices for war agencies, or housing for military personnel. The donations were genuinely patriotic, but they also solved a practical problem. The families could not operate these houses anyway. Donating them was better than leaving them empty. Some owners hoped to reclaim the properties after the war. Most never did. The institutions stayed. The houses never returned to private use. The few mansions that remained in private hands through the war were barely maintained. Families closed off floors. They heated only a few rooms. They lived in small portions of enormous buildings. The houses deteriorated rapidly. Plaster cracked, roofs leaked, paint peeled, wood rotted. By 1945, mansions that had been immaculate in 1940 were falling apart. Bringing them back to proper condition would cost more than they were worth. When the war ended in August 1945, the mansion owners faced a decision: restore the houses or give up and move to apartments. Almost all chose apartments. The returning servicemen needed housing urgently. The government was pushing construction of apartments and suburban homes. But luxury mansions? No one wanted them. No one could afford them. The post-war economy had no place for Fifth Avenue palaces. The demolition wave that had slowed during the war accelerated dramatically in the late 1940s. Mansion after mansion came down. The William Vanderbilt House fell in 1947. The Havemeyer Mansion was demolished in 1948. The Senator Clark House, which had cost $7 million to build in 1911, was destroyed in 1950. The wrecking crews were busy for years. The sound of demolition was constant on Fifth Avenue and the surrounding streets. The architectural loss was staggering. Buildings that had taken years to design and construct were destroyed in weeks. Craftsmen had spent months carving stone details that were smashed to rubble. Artisans had created plaster ceilings that were ripped down. The interiors had been furnished with pieces purchased from European estates. All of it was dispersed or destroyed. Some architectural elements were salvaged: mantels, doors, paneling. These pieces ended up in museums or were installed in other buildings, but most went to landfills. The destruction was thorough. What replaced the mansions revealed the economic forces at work. Apartment buildings went up on some sites. These buildings had hundreds of units generating steady income through rents or maintenance fees. Office buildings replaced other mansions. Retail stores took over corner properties. Every use was more profitable than a single-family mansion. The land was too valuable for private houses. The mathematics were inescapable. A few mansion owners tried to hold on. They believed the trend would reverse. They thought wealthy families would eventually want private houses again. They were wrong. Each year made apartments more dominant. Each year made mansions less viable. The last holdouts eventually surrendered. By 1960, almost no private mansions remained on Fifth Avenue. The few survivors were either museums or used for institutional purposes. The era of private palaces in Manhattan was finished. The apartment buildings that survived and thrived developed strong identities. 740 Park Avenue remained the most exclusive. The waiting list for apartments there was years long. When units came on the market, multiple buyers competed. The prices climbed steadily. An apartment that sold for $100,000 in 1940 might bring $500,000 by 1960. The appreciation was extraordinary, especially compared to mansions that had become worthless. The Dakota celebrated its 75th anniversary in 1959. The building that had been mocked as too far uptown in 1884 was now a historic landmark. The cooperative board maintained the building beautifully. The apartments were updated carefully to preserve original details while adding modern conveniences. Living in the Dakota meant something. You were connected to New York history. You occupied a building that had changed how wealthy people lived. The address had prestige that money alone could not buy. Other buildings developed their own characters. 1040 Fifth Avenue was known for residents who valued privacy and quiet. 834 Fifth Avenue attracted families with young children because the apartments were enormous and the building had wonderful park views. 778 Park Avenue was almost as selective as 740 Park, but slightly less formal. Each building had its devotees who insisted their address was the best. The competition continued, but now it was between apartment buildings rather than between mansions. The cooperative boards wielded enormous power by the 1950s. They had decades of experience managing buildings and vetting potential residents. The standards were clear, even if unwritten. Wealth was necessary but not sufficient. You needed to demonstrate liquid assets well beyond the purchase price. The rule of thumb was that your net worth should be 10 times the apartment cost. If you were buying a $500,000 apartment, you needed to show $5 million in assets. This ensured you could afford maintenance fees even if markets crashed. Professional background mattered. Some professions were more acceptable than others. Banking, law, and corporate leadership were fine. Entertainment was questionable. People in show business, even if very wealthy, faced skepticism. The boards worried they would be too visible, attract too much attention, bring paparazzi to the building. Athletes faced similar concerns. The boards wanted residents who lived quietly and did not draw public notice. The interview process was intimidating deliberately. You submitted financial documents first, tax returns for several years, bank statements, investment account statements, letters from your accountants and lawyers. The board reviewed everything. If your finances passed scrutiny, you were invited to interview with board members. The meetings were formal. You dressed conservatively. You answered questions about your life, your work, your plans. You tried to demonstrate that you would be a good neighbor, a good steward of property values, someone who would fit in. Rejection was common and humiliating. The boards usually did not explain their decisions. You simply received a letter saying your application was not approved. No reasons given. No appeals allowed. Your broker would quietly let you know you should not reapply. The unofficial explanation sometimes circulated. Too flashy, too young, too recently wealthy, wrong profession, wrong background. The criteria were arbitrary and discriminatory, but legal. The boards could reject anyone for any reason or no reason. The discrimination was often explicitly about ethnicity and religion. Jewish buyers faced rejection from many buildings, regardless of wealth or accomplishment. Black buyers were rejected universally. The boards did not state these policies explicitly, but everyone understood them. The buildings maintained religious and ethnic homogeneity through the rejection process. This discrimination would eventually become illegal, but in the 1950s it was standard practice. The buildings that practiced the strictest discrimination commanded the highest prices. This seemed paradoxical, but made economic sense. The buyers knew their neighbors would be carefully selected. They knew the building would maintain certain standards. They were paying for exclusivity. The more people rejected, the more valuable acceptance became. The discrimination increased property values even as it excluded qualified buyers. Some developers recognized this was wrong and tried to create more open buildings. They accepted residents based purely on financial qualifications. They rejected discrimination. These buildings were successful, but never achieved the prestige of the most exclusive cooperatives. The market rewarded discrimination. Buildings that accepted everyone were worth less than buildings that rejected most applicants. The economics incentivized behavior that was morally indefensible. By 1960, the luxury apartment system was mature and stable. The buildings that would define New York for the next 50 years were all standing. 740 Park Avenue, 778 Park Avenue, 834 Fifth Avenue, 1040 Fifth Avenue, the Dakota, the San Remo, the Beresford. Each had established its reputation. Each had its loyal residents. The addresses meant something. They conveyed status. They indicated you had arrived. The residents formed a community without intending to. The people who lived in these buildings moved in the same circles. Their children attended the same schools. They belonged to the same clubs. They summered in the same places. The buildings were nodes in a network of privilege that encompassed education, business, and social life. Living at the right address opened doors throughout that network. The architecture of these buildings was aging gracefully. The best buildings from the 1910s and 1920s looked better over time. The classical designs were timeless. The proportions remained beautiful. The materials had patinated elegantly. Limestone had weathered to subtle variations in color. Bronze had developed green patina. The buildings looked substantial and permanent. They would clearly last for centuries. The mansions they replaced had mostly lasted less than 50 years. The interiors were being updated carefully. Original details were preserved. The plaster moldings, the hardwood floors, the marble fireplaces. But kitchens and bathrooms were modernized. Wiring was upgraded. Plumbing was improved. The buildings adapted to changing technology without losing their character. A resident in 1960 could enjoy modern conveniences while living in a space that felt connected to the building's history. The economics continued to favor apartments over any alternative. Manhattan real estate was appreciating rapidly, but apartment maintenance fees were climbing slowly. The cost of living in a luxury apartment remained a fraction of what mansion ownership would have required. People who bought apartments in 1930 and held them through 1960 saw extraordinary returns. The purchase price in 1930 might have been $50,000. The value in 1960 might be $400,000. An eightfold increase over 30 years. Plus, they had lived comfortably the entire time for reasonable monthly costs. The mansion owners who had held on through the decades regretted their stubbornness. They had spent fortunes maintaining buildings that declined in value. They had tied up capital in real estate that generated no income. They had burdened themselves with enormous operating costs. And they had nothing to show for it except buildings no one wanted to buy. The few mansion owners remaining in 1960 were trapped. They could not sell. They could not afford to stay. They were waiting for circumstances to force their hands. The luxury apartment system that emerged between 1880 and 1960 represented a complete revolution in how wealthy Americans lived in cities. The change was not just architectural. It was economic, social, and cultural. Apartments offered advantages mansions could not match. Lower costs, better services, more flexibility, equal or superior prestige. The wealthy had chosen apartments not because they had to, but because apartments were actually better. That was the fundamental insight. The system changed because the new system was superior to the old. The 1960s and 1970s tested whether luxury apartments could survive dramatic social change. The post-war consensus was fragmenting. Urban riots shook American cities. Crime rates climbed, middle-class families fled to suburbs. Manhattan lost population for the first time in its history. The city faced bankruptcy. The future looked grim. Yet the luxury apartment buildings on Fifth Avenue and Park Avenue remained stable. The best addresses maintained their value even as the city around them struggled. The reasons were specific and instructive. The wealthy residents of these buildings were insulated from urban problems. Their doormen provided security. Their buildings were fortresses. The elevators required keys. The lobbies were monitored. No one entered without permission. Inside these buildings, you could live as if the city's problems did not exist. The contrast between interior and exterior was stark. Outside, chaos. Inside, order. The location of these buildings also protected them. Fifth Avenue and Park Avenue between 59th and 96th Streets remained safe. The neighborhoods to the east and west might have problems, but the avenues themselves were stable. The concentration of wealth created its own security. The police presence was heavy. The buildings maintained private security. The streets were well lit. The area functioned as an island of stability in a troubled city. The residents of luxury cooperatives were committed financially in ways that suburban homeowners were not. When crime rose in suburbs, people could sell their houses and move to safer areas, but cooperative apartments were harder to sell quickly. The board approval process took time. The market for million-dollar apartments was limited. Residents had incentives to stay and protect their investments rather than flee. They pressured the city to maintain services in their neighborhoods. They organized to ensure safety. The cooperative boards adapted to changing times while maintaining standards. Some discrimination became illegal. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 prohibited racial discrimination in housing sales and rentals. The boards could no longer reject buyers explicitly because of race. But they found ways to maintain selectivity. Financial requirements stayed strict. The interview process remained intimidating. Boards could always claim financial concerns or personality conflicts justified rejection. The law changed the rhetoric, but not always the results. The apartments themselves were appreciating dramatically despite urban problems. Inflation was high in the 1970s. Real estate was one of the few assets that kept pace. An apartment purchased for $200,000 in 1960 might be worth $800,000 by 1975. The appreciation made residents wealthy, even without income. They could borrow against their equity. They could sell at enormous profits. The apartments were not just homes. They were investment vehicles that happened to be places you lived. Rosario Candela died in 1953, but his buildings defined luxury living for decades after. The floor plans he created remained the standard. Architects studying apartment design examined Candela's work. The proportions he achieved were still studied. His buildings commanded premiums. A Candela apartment was worth more than a comparable unit in a building by a lesser architect. His legacy was secure. He had created the template for how wealthy people lived in cities. The 1970s saw new luxury construction resume after a long pause. Developers recognized that demand for high-end apartments remained strong despite urban problems. They built towers with modern amenities that older buildings lacked: central air conditioning, modern kitchens, large bathrooms. The new buildings could not match the grandeur of pre-war construction, but they offered conveniences residents valued. The market absorbed new inventory easily. Wealthy buyers wanted options. One building that rose in the 1970s became controversial. Olympic Tower opened in 1976 on 5th Avenue at 51st Street. The building was mixed use, retail on lower floors, offices in the middle, luxury condominiums above. The design was modern, glass and steel rather than limestone. The apartments were expensive. The views were spectacular. But the location was too far downtown for some buyers. And the mixed-use concept worried traditionalists who wanted purely residential buildings. Olympic Tower introduced the condominium model to luxury New York real estate. Condominiums differed from cooperatives in important ways. In a condo, you owned your apartment outright. In a co-op, you owned shares in a corporation that owned the building. Condos were easier to buy. No board approval required beyond financial verification. You could rent your unit without permission. You could sell to anyone. The flexibility appealed to wealthy foreigners and busy professionals who did not want to deal with co-op boards. The traditional cooperatives saw condominiums as threats. The lack of board control meant you could not screen your neighbors. Anyone with money could buy in. The buildings might lose their exclusive character, property values might suffer. The co-op boards were horrified at the idea of condos spreading. They doubled down on their own standards. They became even more selective. They wanted to demonstrate that cooperatives maintained quality that condos could not match, but condominiums had advantages cooperatives could not offer. Foreign buyers loved condos because board approval was minimal. Wealthy people from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East bought Manhattan condos as investments or occasional residences. They did not want to justify their lives to co-op boards. They wanted simple transactions. Condos provided that. The international money flowing into Manhattan real estate through condos was enormous. The market was globalizing. Celebrities also preferred condos. Co-op boards often rejected famous actors, musicians, and athletes. The boards worried about publicity and paparazzi. Condos did not care. If you had the money, you could buy. This meant condos attracted a different type of resident, more visible, more varied, less traditionally establishment. The buildings developed different characters. Some people found this refreshing. Others found it problematic. The competition between co-ops and condos played out through the 1980s and 1990s. Both models succeeded, but served different buyers. Co-ops remained the choice for traditional wealthy families who valued selectivity. Condos appealed to international buyers, celebrities, and people who wanted flexibility. The market was large enough for both. Manhattan had become the global capital of luxury real estate. The demand was virtually unlimited. The prices in top buildings became absurd by historical standards. An apartment at 740 Park Avenue that had sold for $100,000 in 1950 might sell for $5 million in 1990. That was a 50-fold increase over 40 years. The appreciation far exceeded inflation. It exceeded stock market returns. It exceeded almost any investment. The apartments were making residents extraordinarily wealthy just by existing. The economic logic that had made apartments superior to mansions in 1900 was still operating. Apartment buildings in prime locations were perfect investments. The buildings themselves required constant maintenance and occasional renovation. The co-op boards took these responsibilities seriously. They hired the best architects and contractors. They did work correctly, even when it cost more. They maintained their buildings as if they would last forever, because they would. These buildings were too valuable and too well constructed to ever be demolished. They would be renovated and updated indefinitely. They were permanent. Some buildings undertook major renovations in the 1980s and 1990s. They upgraded electrical systems. They improved plumbing. They added central air conditioning. They renovated lobbies. They replaced elevators. The work was expensive. Special assessments cost residents tens or hundreds of thousands each, but the work was necessary. The buildings needed to stay competitive, and the improvements increased property values more than they cost. The assessments were investments that paid returns. The Dakota went through extensive restoration in the 1980s. The exterior was cleaned and repaired. The interior common areas were renovated. The mechanical systems were upgraded. The building looked better than it had in decades. The restoration cost millions. The residents paid through special assessments. No one complained. The Dakota was too important. The address was too valuable. Maintaining the building properly was not optional. 740 Park Avenue remained the most selective cooperative in New York. The board's reputation was legendary. Billionaires were rejected. Famous people were rejected. The board looked for specific qualities that were hard to define but impossible to fake. You needed to be wealthy, obviously, but you also needed to be the right kind of wealthy. Understated, discreet, connected. The board could sense pretenders. They could identify people who did not belong. Their rejection rate stayed above 90%. The residents of 740 Park Avenue wielded enormous power in business and finance. The building was sometimes called the world's richest apartment house. The concentration of wealth and influence was staggering. CEOs of major corporations lived there. Investment bankers who managed billions, heirs to industrial fortunes. The conversations in 740 Park elevators probably affected more people than anything said in most government buildings. The address had become synonymous with American corporate power. Other buildings competed for prestige but never quite matched 740 Park. 78 Park Avenue was almost as exclusive, and many preferred its slightly lower profile. 834 Fifth Avenue had spectacular apartments and attracted old money families. 1040 Fifth Avenue remained a favorite for people who valued park views above everything else. Each building had its loyalists. Each maintained strict standards. The competition kept everyone striving to be the best. The co-op boards evolved sophisticated systems for evaluating applicants. They required complete financial disclosure. They hired investigators to verify information. They checked references carefully. They interviewed multiple times. The process took months. It was designed to be difficult. The boards wanted to ensure that only the most qualified buyers were approved. The system worked. The buildings maintained their quality and their exclusivity. Some applicants tried to game the system. They hired consultants who specialized in co-op board applications. These consultants knew what boards wanted to see. They helped clients present themselves favorably. They coached them for interviews. They managed the process. The consulting industry thrived. It revealed how much people valued admission to the right buildings. They were willing to pay for help. They were willing to do whatever it took to get approved. The boards responded by becoming even more sophisticated. They could identify applicants who were too polished, too rehearsed. The boards wanted genuine people who would be good neighbors, not performers who said what they thought the board wanted to hear. The interview process became psychological. Board members tried to see through the presentations to the real person beneath. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they were fooled, but they tried. The maintenance fees in these buildings climbed steadily. By the 1990s, a large apartment at a top building might have monthly fees of $5,000 to $10,000. That covered all building operations, taxes, insurance, staff salaries, utilities, maintenance, reserves. The fees seemed enormous. But compared to operating a private mansion, they were nothing. And they were predictable. No surprises, no emergency expenses. You knew exactly what you would pay. That certainty was valuable. The buildings generated no income for their owners. Co-ops were not investment properties in the traditional sense. You could not rent out your apartment easily. The boards restricted rentals. You lived there or you sold. But the appreciation more than compensated. The apartments rose in value faster than almost any income-producing investment. You made money by owning and waiting. The longer you held, the more you made. Time was the multiplier. By 2000, the luxury apartment system that had emerged a century earlier was fully mature. The buildings were stable. The economics were proven. The social system was established. The best addresses were identified. Living in the right building meant something clear and specific. You had wealth, you had taste, you had been approved by people who mattered. The apartment buildings had completely replaced mansions as markers of elite status. The transformation was total and permanent. The 21st century brought forces that should have destroyed the luxury apartment system. Global capital flooded into Manhattan real estate. Foreign billionaires bought apartments they rarely occupied. Prices climbed to levels that seemed impossible to sustain. A 3-bedroom apartment at 740 Park Avenue sold for $30 million in 2012. That was 300 times what a comparable unit sold for in 1950. The appreciation had outpaced every economic measure. It seemed unsustainable, yet it continued. The financial crisis of 2008 tested whether luxury real estate could survive economic collapse. The stock market crashed. Banks failed. Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. The financial system nearly collapsed. Manhattan should have been devastated, yet the top apartment buildings barely noticed. Prices dipped slightly in 2009. They recovered by 2010. By 2012, they exceeded pre-crisis levels. The wealthy were getting wealthier, even during recessions. Their apartments reflected that. The reasons were global. American wealth was being supplemented by international money. Russian oligarchs bought apartments. Chinese billionaires purchased units for their children attending American universities. Middle Eastern royalty invested in Manhattan real estate. The market was no longer just New York families. It was global elites seeking safe places to store wealth. Manhattan luxury apartments were perfect for that purpose. The cooperative boards faced new challenges. International buyers often failed traditional screening. They had wealth but not American financial histories. They had money but not local connections. They were difficult to evaluate using standard methods. Some boards adapted. They accepted documentation from foreign banks. They verified wealth through international channels. They approved buyers they would have rejected 20 years earlier. Other boards held firm. They maintained American-focused standards. They accepted only buyers they could fully vet. 740 Park Avenue remained the most resistant to change. The board continued rejecting billionaires. They turned away international buyers regardless of wealth. They wanted residents who understood the building's culture, who valued discretion, who would be present and engaged. Absentee owners who visited twice a year were not welcome. No amount of money could override those preferences. The building's standards were not for sale. But many buildings found international money too lucrative to refuse. The prices foreign buyers would pay exceeded anything Americans offered. A Russian billionaire might pay $50 million for an apartment, an American would buy for $35 million. The premium was enormous. Co-op boards could maintain their buildings better with wealthier residents. They could build larger reserve funds. They could undertake renovations without special assessments. The international money solved financial problems even as it created cultural tensions. Some buildings became dominated by international owners. 15 Central Park West opened in 2008 as a luxury condominium. The building was designed by Robert A.M. Stern. The apartments were spectacular. The pricing was aggressive. Units sold for thousands of dollars per square foot. Many buyers were foreign. The building quickly became known for absentee owners. Apartments stayed dark most of the year. The building was more investment vehicle than residential community. This transformation worried traditionalists. Buildings were becoming safety deposit boxes for wealth rather than homes. The apartments were empty. The lobbies were quiet. The buildings lost their community feeling. No children played. No dinner parties happened. The buildings became husks. Beautiful, but lifeless. This was not what Edward Clark had envisioned when he built the Dakota. This was something entirely different. The condominium model accelerated these trends. Condos did not restrict rentals or limit occupancy. You could buy a condo and never visit. You could rent it out immediately. The building could not stop you. This flexibility appealed to investors but destroyed community. Traditional co-ops maintained that community mattered, that knowing your neighbors mattered, that being present mattered. They enforced those values through their boards. Condos could not or would not. The price levels reached by 2015 were staggering. Penthouses sold for $100 million or more. Apartments measured by floor, not just by square footage. A full-floor apartment at a top building might cost $40 to $60 million. The buyers were hedge fund managers, tech billionaires, international oligarchs. The sums involved were almost abstract, numbers too large to comprehend. The apartments themselves were spectacular. 20-foot ceilings, private elevators, custom everything. But were they really worth $50 million? The market said yes. Some economists worried the market was a bubble. Prices this high could not be sustained. Eventually, there would be a correction. Owners would lose fortunes. The buildings would lose value. The predictions were logical, but they kept being wrong. The prices kept rising. Every prediction of collapse was followed by further appreciation. The market seemed immune to normal economic forces. The reasons were structural. Global wealth was increasing faster than luxury real estate supply in prime locations. Manhattan had limited land. The best buildings were already built. You could not create more apartments at 740 Park Avenue. You could not add units to the Dakota. Supply was fixed. Demand was growing. Economics dictated that prices would rise indefinitely. As long as global wealth increased, Manhattan luxury apartments would appreciate. Some new construction tried to capture this market. Developers built super tall towers on West 57th Street, buildings over 1,000 feet tall with apartments starting at $20 million. The towers offered views that older buildings could not match. You could see for miles in every direction. The apartments were modern with the latest technology and finishes. The buildings competed with the established co-ops for the same wealthy buyers. But the new towers could not replicate what the older buildings offered. History, character, provenance. You could buy a new apartment with perfect views, but you could not buy into a building where Rockefellers had lived for generations. You could not claim an address that had meant something for a century. The older buildings had intangible value the new construction could never create. That value commanded premiums. The Dakota proved this point perfectly. The building was over 100 years old in 2000. The apartments were not the largest. The finishes were not the newest. The building had no modern amenities like gyms or pools, but apartments there sold for extraordinary prices. The address was legendary. Living in the building connected you to New York history. That connection had value money could not really measure, but buyers paid for it anyway. Some buildings modernized carefully to stay competitive. They added amenities older buildings lacked: fitness centers in former storage spaces, playrooms for children, private dining rooms for residents to host parties, roof decks with plantings and seating. The improvements were expensive but necessary. The buildings competed with new construction that offered these features from the start. The older buildings had to adapt while preserving their character. The tension between preservation and modernization created conflicts. Some residents wanted to maintain buildings exactly as built. Others wanted updates and improvements. The co-op boards mediated these disputes. They tried to balance competing interests. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they made decisions that angered factions. The buildings were democracies of a sort. The shareholders elected boards. The boards made decisions. But not everyone agreed with those decisions. The generational divide was real. Older residents remembered when the buildings were new. They valued historical preservation. They wanted to maintain traditions. Younger residents wanted modern conveniences. They cared less about history. They wanted buildings to function like hotels: full service, responsive management, modern technology. The boards tried to satisfy both groups. It was impossible. Someone was always unhappy. The buildings themselves were aging in complex ways. The best buildings from the 1920s were nearly a century old. They had been maintained well, but everything eventually needed replacement. Elevators, plumbing, electrical systems, roofs, windows. The work was constant and expensive. The reserve funds many buildings had built up during prosperous years were being depleted by necessary capital improvements. Some buildings had to charge special assessments. Residents who had paid millions for their apartments suddenly owed hundreds of thousands more. The assessments created tensions. Some residents could afford them easily. Others were cash poor despite owning valuable apartments. They had bought decades earlier when prices were lower. Their apartments were worth millions, but they lived on fixed incomes. Coming up with $200,000 for a special assessment was difficult or impossible. They had to borrow against their equity or sell. The buildings were pricing out their longest-term residents. The irony was painful. Some buildings offered financing for assessments. Residents could pay over time rather than in lump sums. This helped people on limited incomes. It also ensured work could proceed without delays. The boards wanted to maintain their buildings properly. Deferring needed work just made problems worse. Better to do it now, even if it meant financing arrangements. The boards were learning to be flexible. The staff in these buildings remained essential: doormen, porters, maintenance workers, elevator operators in the older buildings that still had them. These workers made the buildings function. They provided security and service. They knew the residents and their preferences. The best staff had worked in their buildings for decades. They had institutional knowledge you could not replace easily. When they retired, the buildings lost something intangible but important. The wages for building staff increased significantly over the years. A doorman in 1950 might earn $3,000 annually. By 2010, doormen at luxury buildings earned $60,000 to $80,000 plus benefits. The costs had risen 20-fold. The maintenance fees reflected these expenses, but residents accepted the costs because the service was essential. You could not run these buildings without good staff. You had to pay for quality. The unions representing building workers were powerful. They negotiated aggressively. They struck when necessary. A strike could shut down a building completely. No doormen, no porters, no elevator operators. Residents would have to carry packages themselves, walk upstairs, receive deliveries at the door. The inconvenience was intolerable. The boards usually settled rather than face strikes. The workers knew their leverage. They used it. The luxury apartment system that had emerged in the 1880s and matured through the 20th century was facing its first real challenges in the 21st century. International money was transforming the market. Prices were climbing beyond what made traditional sense. Buildings were becoming investments rather than homes. The community that had been essential was disappearing. These changes threatened what made luxury apartments special. Not the physical buildings. Those would stand for centuries. But the culture, the sense of place, the meaning of an address. Those intangible qualities were at risk. Whether they would survive or disappear depended on choices the buildings made going forward. The question facing luxury apartments in the 2020s is whether they can maintain meaning in a globalized market. When Edward Clark built the Dakota in 1884, he was creating housing for New York's elite. The building served a specific community. The residents knew each other. They shared social networks. The building was part of the city's fabric. But now apartments are traded globally like commodities. Owners live on other continents. The connection to place has weakened. The buildings risk becoming just expensive boxes in the sky. Some buildings resist this trend actively. 40 Park Avenue maintains its traditional standards. The board still interviews every applicant. They still reject buyers who do not fit the building's culture. They prioritize residents who will be present and engaged. The approach works. The building maintains community even as others lose it. But the pressure is constant. The international buyers offer so much money. Saying no requires discipline. Not every building has that discipline. The Dakota benefits from landmark status and legendary reputation. The building cannot be altered significantly without approval from preservation authorities. This protects the architecture. The cooperative board maintains strict standards for residents. They want people who understand what the building represents, who will be good stewards. The building remains a community. Residents know each other. They care about the building's history and future. The Dakota functions as it was intended. Other buildings are less successful at maintaining community. Some cooperatives have become majority absentee owners. The apartments stay dark most of the year. The lobbies are empty. The buildings operate like storage facilities for wealth. The doormen see more real estate brokers than residents. This was not the vision. This was not what made apartments superior to mansions. The buildings have lost their purpose, even while gaining monetary value. The pandemic of 2020 tested every assumption about urban living. When COVID-19 arrived, wealthy residents fled Manhattan for country houses and beach properties. The city emptied. The buildings went quiet. Many owners did not return for a year or more. The exodus revealed how many apartments were owned by people with multiple residences. The buildings were just one option among many, not primary homes, not essential, just investments that could be abandoned when convenient. Some observers predicted this would destroy the Manhattan luxury market. Why pay millions for an apartment you abandon during crises? Why accept the risks of city living when you can be comfortable elsewhere? The predictions seemed logical, but they were wrong. By 2021, wealthy buyers were returning. Prices resumed their climb. The best buildings saw increased demand. The pandemic pause was temporary. The underlying forces driving the market had not changed. The reasons were complex. Cities offer advantages. Suburbs and rural areas cannot match. Cultural institutions, restaurants, social life, proximity to work for those who still worked. The wealthy who left during lockdowns remembered why they had chosen cities in the first place. They returned, and they bought. The demand was as strong as ever. Maybe stronger because the pandemic had reminded people what they valued. The buildings themselves had demonstrated resilience. The staff had continued working throughout the pandemic. The doormen, the porters, the maintenance crews. They had kept the buildings operating. They had received packages. They had maintained security. They had done their jobs even when it was dangerous. The residents who stayed appreciated this. They recognized that the buildings provided stability during crisis, that the systems worked, that they were safe. The cooperative model proved its worth during the pandemic. The boards made decisions quickly. They implemented safety protocols. They managed building operations carefully. They communicated with residents effectively. The buildings functioned because they had governance structures, because people were responsible. Condominium buildings without strong governance struggled more. They had no one making decisions, no one coordinating responses. The co-ops demonstrated that management mattered, that community mattered. By 2023, the Manhattan luxury market had fully recovered. Prices exceeded pre-pandemic levels. New construction resumed. International buyers returned. The market dynamics were back to normal. If anything, demand had intensified. The pandemic had reminded wealthy people that quality housing mattered, that location mattered, that security and services mattered, all the things luxury apartments provided. The value proposition was stronger than ever. The buildings that thrived were those that maintained standards, that enforced occupancy requirements, that built and preserved community. The buildings that became investment vehicles struggled with identity. They had high prices, but low satisfaction. Residents who were present felt isolated in empty buildings. The boards of these buildings recognized the problem. They started implementing policies to encourage occupancy, minimum stay requirements, restrictions on rentals, efforts to build community. The course corrections were difficult but necessary. The architecture of the great apartment buildings remains their foundation. The buildings from the 1920s are now a century old. They have been maintained meticulously. They look better than many newer buildings. The limestone has aged beautifully. The proportions remain perfect. The craftsmanship is evident. These buildings will stand for centuries more. They are permanent parts of the Manhattan skyline. Future generations will live in them, will appreciate them, will recognize their importance. Rosario Candela's floor plans still influence apartment design. Modern architects study his work. They try to replicate what he achieved. The proportions, the flow, the separation of public and private spaces. No one has quite matched him. His apartments feel right in ways that are hard to articulate. You know when you are in a Candela apartment. The space works. The rooms relate properly to each other. The whole is greater than the parts. His genius was creating that harmony. The legacy of the Dakota extends far beyond one building. Edward Clark proved that wealthy people would accept apartments if the quality was high enough. He demonstrated that luxury and apartment living were not contradictory. He showed that buildings could be designed to feel like private houses while providing shared services. Every luxury apartment built since the Dakota owes something to Clark's vision. He changed how cities work, how wealthy people live, how real estate developers think. One building altered the course of urban history. The Fifth Avenue mansions that once lined the avenue are almost entirely gone. The Vanderbilt houses, the Astor palaces, the dozens of elaborate residences built between 1880 and 1920. They were demolished decades ago. What replaced them? Apartment buildings mostly. The very structures that made mansions obsolete. The transformation was total. The avenue that defined Gilded Age excess became a canyon of apartment towers. The mansions lost. The apartments won. The victory was complete. A few mansions survived by transforming their purpose. The Frick Collection remains one of New York's great museums. The building is preserved perfectly. It functions as Henry Clay Frick intended, as a public institution housing his collection. The transformation from private residence to museum saved the building. It also validated Frick's theory that architecture could outlast reputation, that buildings could rewrite history. The museum is beautiful. The collection is important. Few visitors know or care about Homestead. The building has done its work. The Cooper Hewitt Museum occupies Andrew Carnegie's former mansion. The building houses the Smithsonian's design collection. It is open to the public. The mansion that Carnegie built to demonstrate his wealth now serves a democratic purpose. Anyone can visit. Anyone can learn. The transformation seems fitting. Carnegie preached the gospel of wealth, the idea that the rich should use their money for public benefit. His mansion does that now. It serves the purpose he articulated, if not the one he originally intended. But these survivors are exceptions. The rule is demolition. The Gilded Age mansions are gone. The apartment buildings remain. The buildings that made economic sense survived. The buildings that consumed wealth without generating income disappeared. The market was brutally efficient. Beauty and history could not overcome poor economics. The buildings that worked financially still stand. The buildings that did not work are memories. The lesson is clear. Economics always wins. The luxury apartment system that emerged between 1880 and 1930 represented a complete revolution in urban living. Wealthy people abandoned private palaces for shared buildings. They gave up absolute control for better services. They traded isolation for community. They chose efficiency over display. The change happened because apartments offered genuine advantages, not just cost savings, though those were significant, but practical benefits that made daily life better. The apartments won on merit, not because mansions were unavailable, but because apartments were superior. That superiority continues today. The best apartment buildings in Manhattan are still the best residential option for wealthy urban dwellers. They provide security. They provide services. They provide community for those who want it and privacy for those who do not. They offer flexibility. You can travel knowing your home is maintained and secured. You can live comfortably without household management burdens. The benefits that attracted residents in 1900 still attract them in 2025. The fundamental value proposition has not changed. The prices have changed. An apartment that cost $50,000 in 1930 might cost $50 million today. That is a 1,000-fold increase. The appreciation exceeds any reasonable economic measure. It seems unsustainable. Yet it continues. Because the apartments are not just housing. They are stores of value. They are positions in a global wealth hierarchy. They are symbols of achievement. The prices reflect all of those things simultaneously. The economics are real even when the numbers seem absurd. What was lost when mansions disappeared? Privacy, certainly. The mansion owner controlled an entire building. No neighbors, no shared walls. Complete freedom to do whatever you wanted. That level of control is impossible in an apartment. You share a building. You must accommodate others. You give up absolute autonomy. Some people value that more than any practical benefit apartments offer. For them, mansions were better. For everyone else, apartments are superior. Architectural diversity was also lost. The mansions were individually designed. Each was unique. The apartment buildings, even the best ones, follow similar patterns. The layouts are recognizable across buildings. Candela apartments all feel related. The individuality of custom mansion design disappeared. This is a real loss. The city became more uniform, more predictable, less surprising. Beauty remains, but singular vision is rarer. What was gained? Efficiency, sustainability, community, democracy of a sort. The mansion system was wasteful and exclusionary. Huge buildings for single families, enormous staffs, resources consumed for pure display. The apartment system is more efficient. It uses urban land better. It consumes less energy per resident. It requires less labor. The buildings serve more people better. That is progress, even if something was lost along the way. The apartment buildings that redefined elite living are now part of New York's permanent landscape. They will outlast everyone currently alive. They will house multiple generations. They will witness changes we cannot imagine. But they will stand. The buildings are too well constructed to fail, too valuable to demolish, too important to lose. They have become what their builders intended: permanent monuments. Not to individuals, but to a system, to an idea, to the notion that shared luxury could replace private palaces. That idea succeeded. These buildings prove it. Every day they stand, every resident who lives there, every generation that follows. The buildings tell the same story. The apartment won, the mansion lost, the Gilded Age ended, and something better emerged from its ashes.